The sun rose slowly over the vastness of the backlands, tinging the barbed wire fences, the dust of the road, and the sweat on the face of Antonio, a cowboy with a simple soul and a huge heart, with gold. The sound of the horns still echoed through the fields when he, mounted on his old horse, Alazan, began another day of work. His calloused hands held the rope firmly, his serene gaze watched over the herd, and in his chest beat the pride of one born to care for the land and the animals. Antonio was the kind of man who believed in his word, who saw his greatest treasure in work, and in his boss, Seu Laurentino, a man of respect. At least, that's what he believed. The Boa Esperança farm was known throughout the region. Abundant land, strong cattle, and an owner who boasted of being a man of his word. But behind the confident smile and well-pressed clothes, Laurentino hid a heart hardened by greed. He was one of those who only looked down when they needed to step on someone. And even so, Antonio never stopped respecting it. He worked there for more than 10 years, facing drought, disease, and loneliness, always faithful, always willing to do whatever was necessary. But the backlands, just as they teach you how to plant, also teach you how to lose. And it was on one of those days when the wind blew heavily and the smell of rain mingled with that of dust that Antonio's life began to change. A poorly told conversation, a suspicion cast to the wind, and suddenly the man who had always carried a clean name began to be looked upon with suspicion. A whisper in the wrong ears was enough, and the respect he had earned with so much sweat turned to ashes. Laurentino heard rumors, false, cruel, that the cowboy was stealing cattle, selling calves in secret. And without even asking, without looking into the eyes of the man who had served him for over a decade, the boss decided to believe the lie. That afternoon was etched into Antonio's soul like a branding iron. The wind was blowing dryly when Laurentino appeared in the yard. His face was closed, his gaze cold, his voice firm as if sentencing a guilty man. "Antonio, I trusted you, but betrayal. I don't forgive betrayal. Take your things and leave." The silence that followed was more painful than any words. Antonio stood there, bewildered, without a chance to defend himself. He looked around and saw the farmhands standing there, heads bowed, as if they too felt the weight of the injustice, but were afraid to say anything. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He simply lowered his head, took off his hat, and said with the dignity of someone who knows the value of truth, "I can only thank you, boss. You're within your rights." He picked up his old satchel, put the lasso on his shoulder, and walked slowly down the dirt road, leaving behind the pasture, the corral, the years of struggle, and the memories of a time when he still believed in gratitude. The sound of his spurs dragging on the dry ground mingled with the distant crowing of a rooster and the silent weeping of a man who had lost everything, except his honor. At that moment, the sky over the backlands seemed to weep along with the others. Heavy clouds hid the sun, and the wind brought a strange chill, as if nature itself sensed that something much greater was about to come. Laurentino watched from afar, resolute, convinced that he had done the right thing. But deep down, something bothered him, an unease he couldn't explain. The cowboy disappeared down the road, his heart broken and his fate uncertain. The boss returned home, trying to forget what he had done. But time, that old judge of the backlands, does not forget. It observes, waits, and one day it demands its due. And it was from that moment, on that dusty afternoon of farewells, that life began to prepare the price Laurentino would have to pay, because in the backlands, as in life, nothing stays hidden for long. But what happened to that boss when fate finally decided to collect what he had done? Antonio walked without looking back. The dirt road stretched out like an open scar on the dry ground of the backlands. The sun was already hiding behind the mountains, and the distant sound of crickets was the only company in that heavy silence that hurt more than the farewell. He felt his chest tighten, as if each step tore a piece from his soul. The smell of dust mixed with sweat brought back memories of the days when he was just a simple man, happy with little, but full of faith in life. That farm, now left behind, had meant everything to him. It was there that he learned to tame his first ox, laughed with his work friends, and cried in secret when his boss lost his father. Antonio wasn't one to complain about life. He lived simply, but carried within him a wealth that no money could buy: gratitude. From a young age, he learned that work was the only dignified path for those born in the backlands. When he arrived at the Boa Esperanza farm, he was just a skinny boy with an old hat and a big dream: to save money to buy a small piece of land, plant corn, raise some cows, and maybe one day build a mud house to live in peace and freedom. That was Antonio's dream. He didn't want luxury or fortune. He just wanted the right to live by the sweat of his brow without having to bow his head to anyone. The farmhands liked him. They respected his quiet demeanor, his honesty, and that gentle smile that never faded, even on tiring days. Antonio always said, "God helps those who get up early, those who tend the cattle with their hearts, and those who treat the land like a mother." And that's how he lived, believing that goodness would return sooner or later to those who planted with faith. But what he didn't know was that the world doesn't always reciprocate in kind. While he dedicated himself to the farm, so Laurentino saw him only as another employee, never a friend, never a man who wore the farm's shirt with love. And even so, Antonio remained loyal. How many times did he stay late, watching over the pasture so the cattle wouldn't get lost? How many times did he face storms, lightning, and even hunger itself to ensure the work got done? During the previous year's drought, when the pasture ran out and the cattle began to wither, it was Antonio who dug wells with his own hands to fetch water. He would stay up until dawn, his feet cracked and his hands wounded, but he never complained. He would only say, "That's the way of the backlands. We suffer today to reap tomorrow." These words echoed among the cowboys like a prayer. He was the living hope that effort is always worthwhile. And perhaps that was precisely what bothered the boss. Seeing a simple, uneducated man so respected, so loved by everyone. Laurentino liked to be in charge, to be admired, but deep down he feared losing control over those who served him. It was as if the brilliance of Antonio's humility revealed the shadows of his own soul. After being expelled, Antonio spent days wandering. He slept under jujube trees, ate what he could find, and even in his solitude, he never stopped praying. He asked God to enlighten his boss so that he might see the truth. And in each prayer, there was a mixture of pain and hope. The pain of someone who had been wronged, and the hope of someone who believes that destiny never fails. Even from afar, Antonio's heart remained tied to that farm. Sometimes, when the wind blew in the right direction, he swore he could smell the corral, hear the lowing of the cattle, and even the laughter of his workmates. It was as if the backlands spoke to him, reminding him that life has its mysterious ways, and that time always reveals who one truly is. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Antonio found shelter on an abandoned farm. He tended to a few of a neighbor's cattle and survived on what little the land provided. Even with everything he had been through, he didn't lose his faith or the sparkle in his eyes. He continued to believe that one day everything would make sense. And on full moon nights, when the sky of the backlands opened into a sea of stars, he would look up and whisper, "What belongs to man, destiny brings back. It may take time, but it brings it." And it is in this simplicity that Antonio's greatness resides. A man who, even wounded, did not let resentment take root in his heart. A man who proved that being poor is not shameful. Shame lies in losing one's humanity. And perhaps that is why life still had plans for him, plans that not even destiny itself would dare to reveal all at once. Now tell me, do you believe in divine justice? Leave a comment if you, like Antonio, also think that fate never fails. Right, fate always takes its toll. I want to know who still believes that good, even when silent, always triumphs in the end. Time passed slowly since the day Antonio left the Boa Esperanza farm, but destiny, silent and patient, was already beginning to weave the threads that would reunite his life with that of So Laurentino. The boss, a man of firm speech and imposing presence, continued to be respected by many in the region. Those who saw him from afar, mounted on his fine saddled horse, wearing a new leather hat, and with a haughty gaze, could not imagine how much pride and vanity resided in his heart. Laurentino liked to be called doctor, even though he was just a farmer, and he loved it when men greeted him by lowering their hats. That fed his ego. But behind the facade of authority, there was a man tormented by his own ambition. The more wealth he accumulated, the more he distrusted others. He didn't believe in gratuitous kindness, nor in true loyalty. Perhaps that's why it was so easy to believe the lie they told him about Antonio. The farm was growing, the cattle were fattening, and money was circulating. And as always happens where there is prosperity, envy began to circle like vultures over carrion. It was Pedro Bento, a young ranch hand with a smooth tongue and a sly look, who planted the seed of discord. He arrived saying he'd seen Antonio secretly trading calves, that the cowboy was going out at night with a merchant's truck from the city. All lies, but whispered in the right ear, at the right time. A lie has the power to destroy a life. Laurentino listened quietly, and that poison began to spread. In the following days, the boss began to observe the cowboy with different eyes. Every delay, every silence, every distracted glance from Antonio seemed like proof of guilt. And the worst part, Laurentino didn't ask, didn't try to understand. He only fueled the suspicion. The other cowboys noticed the change. They felt the heavy atmosphere, the cold orders, the dry tone with which the boss now treated the man who had been his right-hand man for so long. Antonio, without understanding anything, remained firm, believing that time would put things in their place. But time, on that piece of land, was not on his side. On a sweltering morning, with the sun burning more than ever, Laurentino summoned Antonio to the yard. The cowboy came riding his chestnut horse, sweaty, his face etched with fatigue. Even so, upon reaching his boss, he dismounted, removed his hat, and greeted him respectfully. Laurentino didn't even respond. He stood with his arms crossed, his face tense, his gaze as cold as stone. "Antonio, I gave you a home, food, and trust. But it seems I was wrong," he said, spitting out the words as if they were thorns. The cowboy's eyes widened, confused. "What do you mean, boss? I've never let you down. If I did something wrong, tell me, and I'll explain." Laurentino turned his face away, took a deep breath, and added, "You don't need to explain anything. I already know everything. Take your things and get off my farm. You're not setting foot here again." The silence that followed was more cruel than a slap. The other farmhands, watching from afar, lowered their heads. Antonio felt the world spin. He tried to speak, but his voice choked him. His heart pounded, his face burned with shame and sadness. He searched his boss's eyes for a hint of compassion, a sign of doubt, but found only contempt. "Boss, are you firing me without even hearing my side?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. "I don't argue with traitors," Laurentino replied, turning his back. That was the hardest blow of Antonio's life. He stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand how 10 years of work, loyalty, and sleepless nights could be thrown away with so few words. The wind blew hot, stirring up dust in the yard, and seemed to mock the silence. The chestnut horse neighed softly, as if sensing its owner's pain. Antonio, his heart breaking, lowered his head, tied the lasso around his shoulder, and began walking toward the road. None of the farmhands dared approach. Some wiped the sweat from their faces, others hid their tears. He was a man everyone respected, and seeing him leave like that was like watching a piece of the farm go away with him. As he walked, the sound of his boots hitting the dry ground mingled with the sound of the wind and the distant crowing of a rooster. With each step, a memory came flooding back. His first day of work, the grateful smile of his boss's wife when he saved a newborn calf, the conversations by the fire with his workmates. It all seemed distant now. And Laurentino, he stood there, observing from afar, his chest full of pride and his heart empty. For a moment, something inside him seemed to waver, a pang of doubt, a fleeting regret, but it was quickly swallowed by pride. "I'm the one in charge here," he murmured, trying to convince himself that he was right. That afternoon, the sky darkened. The wind shifted direction, the cattle became restless, and the distant sound of thunder echoed through the valley. It was as if the very backlands knew that an injustice had just been committed. Antonio disappeared in the dust of the road, and Laurentino returned home, thinking he had solved a problem. But what he had actually done was open the door for destiny to begin its work. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever seen a similar injustice happen? Have you ever witnessed someone being accused without guilt? Write, "I saw an injustice" below if you've ever felt this outrage in your heart. I want to know who, like me, believes that time always reveals who was right. Time passed, and the sun of the backlands continued to burn with the same intensity, but the Boa Esperança farm was no longer the same. The name, which once symbolized abundance, now sounded ironic. After Antonio left, something seemed to change in that place. It was as if the soul of the farm had departed along with the cowboy. The cattle, once strong and healthy, began to wither. The land, which had always provided good pasture, turned to dust. The water in the pond, which never ran dry, began to dry up. The wind brought dust and silence, a heavy silence, the kind that sends shivers down even the bravest man's spine. So Laurentino, who used to walk around with his chest puffed out, now lived with a closed face and a lost look. The bills started piling up, the buyers disappeared, and the few remaining farmhands began to leave one by one. Nobody could stand that heavy atmosphere anymore. Some said the farm was turned upside down. Others said Laurentino had been punished for firing the only good man who truly cared about that place. And the boss, proud, pretended not to hear. But deep down, each word was like a thorn piercing his heart. The nights became long and silent. Laurentino, who used to sleep peacefully, began to wake up startled, hearing strange noises, the distant neighing of a horse, the creaking of the house's rafters, the mournful mooing of an ox that no longer existed. It seemed as if the wind carried Antonio's name in every corner of the house. Antonio, Antonio. The old man tried to push it out of his head, telling himself it was just tiredness. But he knew, deep down he knew, that fate had begun to collect the debt he had left unpaid. The days grew burdensome. The drought intensified in a way no one remembered ever seeing before. The pasture turned into a cracked desert, and the smell of dead animals began to fill the air. Vultures circled the sky all day, as if they already knew that a man condemned by his own conscience was there. Laurentino tried to maintain control, selling what he could, promising the farmhands that everything would improve, but each promise vanished into thin air. The money ran out, the banks refused to lend anymore, and even his old friends from the city began to avoid his name. One morning, he woke to a loud noise coming from the corral. He ran, stumbling over his own feet, and found one of his most valuable oxen lying dead on the ground. The animal seemed to have cried before dying. Laurentino knelt right there, clutching his hat to his chest, and for the first time in many years felt like crying. But his pride was still stronger. He stood up, wiped his face, and said to himself, "It's just bad luck, everything will pass." But it didn't. Each day brought a new loss, a new blow. And as the farm crumbled, Laurentino also began to wither. The man who was once a symbol of power now walked hunched over, with a distant look and unshaven beard. He barely ate, barely slept. He sat on the porch, staring at the cracked, silent horizon, remembering even unwillingly Antonio's calm face, that simple smile and gentle voice saying, "God helps those who don't lose faith." These words echoed in his mind like a punishment. This is where the shadow began to manifest itself. Jung said that we all have a dark side, the part we hide from the world, but which one day comes to the surface when we deny too much who we are. And Laurentino, who always considered himself above everything and everyone, now found himself face to face with his own shadow. Loneliness, fear, regret. He began to see the cold man he had become, the boss he had humiliated, the friend he had lost, the worker he had destroyed out of pure pride. At night, sitting on the edge of his bed, he looked at his hands, once firm, now trembling, and wondered where he had lost his way. The large house, once teeming with life and conversation, now echoed with emptiness. The furniture was covered in dust, the clock stopped, the doors creaked in the wind. Sometimes, Laurentino found himself talking to himself, as if conversing with the past. "Would he forgive me?" he murmured, staring into nothingness. Silence answered. Time no longer obeyed him, and the power that had filled him with pride had become a prison. One late afternoon, he walked to the old corral, the same one where he had sent Antonio away. He stopped in the same spot, looked at the ground, and felt a shiver run through his body. The wind blew strongly, raising the dust, and he swore he heard again that voice he had tried to forget. "He who sows contempt reaps emptiness." Those words, coming from who knows where, echoed deeply. And for the first time, Laurentino understood the weight of injustice. The sun hid behind the mountains, and he remained there alone, with a heavy heart and a grievous soul. Everything he had built was crumbling before his eyes. The farm, once a symbol of wealth, was now just a portrait of decay. Fate had taken its revenge, and the price was being paid, not with money, but with what hurts most: regret. And you there listening to me now, have you ever seen fate exact retribution for an injustice? Have you ever witnessed someone reaping what they sowed? If so, comment below. Destiny always comes back. I want to see who believes that life may take its time, but it never leaves anything unanswered. The years went by, and the Backlands, always wise, always just, took care of putting everything in its place. After the fall of the Boa Esperanza farm, no one heard from Sir Laurentino for a while. Some said he had gone to live in the city, trying to sell what remained of the land to pay off his debts. Others swore he still lived there alone, surrounded by memories and regrets, wandering through the empty corrals like a tormented soul. What everyone knew was that the man who was once feared was now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. Meanwhile, life continued its course. Antonio, the cowboy who had left with his head held high, found shelter on the lands of a distant friend in a neighboring town. He started from scratch, caring for a few oxen and some skinny horses. But those who have faith, patience, and hands calloused by work, sooner or later see life flourish again. Little by little he rose up. He helped neighbors, cared for sick animals, and earned the respect and trust of everyone around him. Time was generous to him, not in riches but in what mattered most: wisdom and peace. With what he saved from each job, he bought a small piece of land. It was simple, but it was his. He built a small mud house, planted some trees, made a small corral, and began to live off what the Backlands gave him. Every morning before sunrise, he would say a prayer looking at the horizon and give thanks. The pain of injustice still lived within him, but it no longer hurt him. It was a scar, not an open wound. His neighbors called him Mr. Antonio of Hope, and the name was fitting. Wherever he went, he left peace, advice, and a kind word. He became a respected man, an experienced cowboy who now helped the younger ones learn the trade. When someone complained about the hard life, he would simply smile and say, "The backlands teach, my son. We suffer, but we learn. And destiny, destiny never fails." One day, the sun was slowly setting behind the mountains when Antonio, returning from a horseback ride, spotted a man lying by the roadside. The horse stopped on its own, as if it too had sensed something different at that moment. The cowboy dismounted, walked over to the man, and as he approached, time seemed to stand still. The aged face, the white beard, the trembling hands. It took him a few seconds to recognize him, but there was no doubt. It was So Laurentino. The former boss was thin, dejected, with sunken eyes and skin marked by illness and time. He wore old, torn clothes, held a dirty hat against his chest, and breathed with difficulty. Seeing Antonio approach, he tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. Fate, the very fate he had proudly defied, now placed him before the man he had most humiliated. Antonio bent down, looked him straight in the eyes, and remained silent for a few seconds. The boss, his voice hoarse and tired, tried to speak. I didn't know what I was doing, Antonio. I was a fool, a man blinded by arrogance." The cowboy took a deep breath, grabbed the water bottle he carried in his saddle, and without saying a word, offered it to him. Laurentino trembled. His hand could barely hold it. Antonio held it too, firmly and compassionately, helping the old boss to drink. The simple gesture, that sip of water in the middle of the hot road, was worth more than any revenge. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the wind. Antonio, gazing at the horizon, said in a serene voice, "Life has taught me that forgiveness is the greatest victory a man can have. I could have left you here, alone. But fate had other plans, and when fate wills it, we obey." Laurentino, overcome with emotion, let the tears stream down his face. He tried to hold Antonio's hand, but the cowboy simply placed his hand on his shoulder and added, "I don't hold a grudge, boss. I only ask that you remember one thing. Power and pride fade, but what we plant in the hearts of others, that remains." The old man wept silently. It was as if each tear washed away a piece of the guilt he had carried for years, and the cowboy, even with a heavy heart, felt peace, not because he had won, but because he understood. Destiny no longer needed to demand anything. The lesson had been taught. Antonio took his former boss into his home and cared for him as if he were a relative. He prepared a simple space for him, got food, and stayed by his side for days. People in the region were surprised when they found out. Many asked, "Why help someone who did you so much harm?" And he always replied, "Because the good we do is the only inheritance life leaves behind." During the nights, the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind hitting the windows and the distant chirping of crickets. Laurentino, lying down, looked at the ceiling and remembered everything he had lost: the farm, respect, friends, and time itself. Sometimes he would quietly ask for forgiveness, thinking Antonio was asleep. But the cowboy heard him. He didn't answer, he didn't judge, he just let time do what it knew best: heal. The old man began to improve little by little, but his health no longer allowed him much time. Antonio cared for him with the same dedication he had previously devoted to the cattle, with calm and faith. One day, Laurentino held his hand and murmured, "If I had half the soul you have, I would have been a better man." Antonio simply smiled, gazing at the sky through the window. The sun rose beautifully, coloring the backlands with a soft glow, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth. It was destiny once again, showing that everything has its time, even forgiveness. And now, tell me, you who are listening, if you were Antonio, would you have forgiven, or would you have let fate do the rest? Write in the comments, "I would forgive too," if you believe that forgiveness is the greatest act of courage that exists. I want to know who, deep down, believes that good always returns, even when the world seems cruel. That morning dawned silently, unlike any other. The wind blew gently, the sun rose slowly, tinging the sky with gold, and the backland seemed at peace, a peace unseen for a long time. Inside the small mud brick house, the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the birdsong, and Antonio watched old Laurentino lying in the hammock, breathing with difficulty, but with a serene expression. The illness had already taken hold of his body, but in his eyes there was a sense of rest, as if, after so long, he had finally found what he had sought most: forgiveness. Antonio approached, adjusted the pillow, and sat there beside him in silence. The old boss slowly opened his eyes, looked at the cowboy, and smiled simply, almost childlike, as if grateful to still have someone nearby. He tried to say something, but his voice wouldn't come out. Antonio simply placed his hand over Antonio's, squeezing lightly, and said, "Don't worry, boss. Every man's time comes, but the important thing is to go in peace." Outside, the wind stirred up the dust of the road, and the sound of the church bell high on the hill announced the first mass of the day. It was as if destiny itself were bidding farewell to Laurentino, witnessing the end of a story that began with pride and ended with humility. The cowboy stood there in silence, looking at the man who had once driven him away under the hot sun, and now, frail and repentant, found shelter precisely in his hands. Life is like that. It turns slowly, but it never stops turning. What we do, what we say, what we plant in the hearts of others, it all comes back sooner or later. Sometimes it comes in the form of pain, sometimes in the form of learning, but it always comes back. And there, in that small piece of land, the Backlands seemed to watch this truth with respect. As the sun began to set, Laurentino breathed his last. It was like a light breeze, a breath that mingles with the wind and is lost in infinity. Antonio watched for a while, his eyes brimming with tears but without resentment. He knew that this was a just end, an end that destiny had patiently prepared, weaving each event together with invisible hands. The boss was leaving, and the cowboy was staying, not with riches, not with vengeance, but with peace. At that moment, he stood up, went out to the yard, and looked at the horizon. The sky was red, beautiful, and the wind blew like a prayer. Antonio took off his hat, looked up and murmured, "May God receive you, boss. May he forgive you, as I have forgiven you." Time seemed to stand still for a moment. The distant sound of cattle, the rustling of dry leaves, the whistling of the wind, everything formed a melody that was both sad and beautiful. It was as if the very Backlands were bidding farewell to that man, closing a cycle. Days later, Antonio dug the small grave with his own hands under the shade of a jujube tree, the same type of tree where he used to rest on his workdays. He didn't call anyone, didn't make a speech, didn't shed tears. He simply placed his hat on his chest and said a silent prayer. That simple gesture said it all. It was the end of a story of injustice, pain and learning, but also of forgiveness and redemption. As time passed, life went on. The cowboy continued caring for his land, his animals, and the people around him. Every morning, he thanked God for the strength to have endured everything without letting hatred win. His name became an example among his neighbors. Mr. Antonio of Hope, they would say. A man whom fate tested but did not defeat. And what about the Boa Esperanza farm? It's a thing of the past. The weeds have taken over the corral, the roof has collapsed, and the old manor house is now a ruin. But curiously, the name remained. The elders said it was to remind future generations that hope may be forgotten for a time, but it never dies. And that's the lesson, my friend, who is listening to me now. In life, what you do to others always comes back to you. Sometimes it takes a while, sometimes it comes when you least expect it, but it comes back. The cowboy followed his path with dignity, without letting bitterness take over his heart. The boss paid the price for his own arrogance, and destiny wise as the wind of the backlands, did what it knows best: balance what was once unjust. Think about it. How many times do we act impulsively, hurt someone, say things we shouldn't, believing we'll never have to look back? But time passes, and it takes its toll. And not with anger, nor with haste. It takes its toll with silence, with memories, with sleepless nights. And it's at that moment that life shows how much it's worth to be fair, humble, and good. Antonio proved that true power lies not in commanding, but in forgiving. That greatness is not measured by the size of the farm, but by the lightness of the heart. And that forgiveness, however difficult it may seem, is the most beautiful way to win. So, if this story touched your heart, if you believe that life is fair and that time always brings back what we sow, comment below. He who sows pride reaps loneliness. I want to see who understands that destiny may take its time, but it never forgets to deliver justice. The sound of the wind blows in the background. The distant lowing of an ox mingles with the silence of the backlands. The screen slowly fades to black, and the words appear like a whisper of time. He who sows pride reaps solitude.